Hello, everyone. I'm Captain Logan, and it's not Spawn year. It is day 38 of my comic review video day calendar, and today I'm going to review a literal funny book. Yeah, I'm going to take a look at an issue of Resurrection Man. I've always enjoyed these. This is Resurrection Man number 1000 from the second volume of this book. And don't be deceived, there are not 1000 issues, of course, of Radioactive Man, but it continues the gag from the first volume, where each issue is a random, sometimes crazy high number, suggesting that there are a bunch of these and that there are several issues in between each of the few that were published. I think there's only a dozen or so of these, and I own 4 or 5. I actually reviewed a Radioactive Man years and years ago, back on the old comic book late night show, 679, I think, or some silly number like that. And that one was making fun of specifically comic events. So Watchmen was in there, and it was kind of the main story that was being lampooned there, but it also made fun of Crisis on Infinite Earths and Dark Knight Returns and a lot of 80s stuff. This is making fun of something specific in comics as well. I think all of these, or at least most of them, I haven't read everything, are lampooning, satirizing the comic industry in a real similar way that The Simpsons lampoons television and cartoons, although the focus is a lot more on that in these. I mean, The Simpsons is making fun of tropes of the sitcom and lots of other genres in television, but every episode doesn't feel like here's another aspect of TV that we're making fun of, or even always here's another kind of formula for the sitcom that we're taking a look at. This does do that, and of course, you know, if it had run enough issues, it might have had to get away from that. But this one is going to Image and Spawn. So it is not Spawn year. I'm not reviewing a Spawn comic, but we are going to have to talk about Spawn a little bit because this is a satire of Spawn and Image Comics at large. This comes out in 1994, so a couple of years after Spawn starts, and really smack dab in the middle of the massive popularity of the grimdark, gritty, kind of superhero renaissance that we were having in the early 90s. And what I really appreciate about this, besides that it does a really good job of making fun of the format of not just what Spawn and a lot of Image Comics looked like right then, artistically and in the the organization of story, but also just the layout of the comic book itself, what the thing looks like. When you open in Image book in the early 90s, this is the inside cover, and so instead of the Spawn logo, you have the Radioactive Man logo from the front of his costume, but the layout of this page is exactly the same, and the issue is called, the story is In His Own Image, which is thematically what the story is actually about. So we're not just making fun of the name of the company and just, generically tropes in the Spawn and stuff. It's actually taking the name of the company and making the whole story about that. So this is about Radioactive Man's image, his reputation, and it's really sophisticated satire. It's about what the way that Image has changed the look and feel of comics and the reputation of superheroes and comic book storytelling at large in the culture, and specifically the way children are obsessing with everything that is dark and serious and bloody now. And so Radioactive Man is no longer popular because he is too square. He looks too much like a Golden Age comic book character, or at least a Silver Age one, which is a lot of fun because later in the issue he's actually going to turn back into his golden age counterpart, and the whole thing becomes a like 1940s Captain America comic, which is really funny, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So the basic premise here is Radioactive Man wishes he could get the lightning bolt off of his head, because when he had his accident that transformed him and gave him his superpowers, he wound up with this metal rod shaped like a lightning bolt that he can't get out of his head. And it has given him amnesia, which is the first big Spawn-like thing, again, besides panel layouts and like camera placement and stuff. You can see a lot of Todd McFarlane in this without the art itself being drawn like that. It's really impressive how each of these issues manage to maintain, and The Simpsons does this too, maintains its own unique look. It still is The Simpsons, it still is Radioactive Man, but you can see all these hallmarks in whatever the art that it's making fun of is doing. And so you've got that with panel layouts, you've got that with coloring, you've got that with shadow work, and particularly this page is just a direct parody of a page right out of the first issue of Spawn, where you've got Sam and Twitch, and here you have stand-ins for them, and Sam is eating a donut, and it's real crude and kind of gross looking, and this is a lot like what that looked like. And then you'll have characters appear for the first time in full-page spreads with huge word balloons where all of where some of the words are in different colors and sized differently. So this is like the initial introduction to Violator, but now we have a guy who weirdly is kind of our Violator for this issue, and this is Dr. Crabb, who is one of the main bad guys for Radioactive Man, but he's been transformed now into a giant prawn, and of course he's called Prawn because it rhymes with Spawn, but he's not actually a parody of Spawn. One of the things I really appreciate about the way Radioactive Man does parody is it's not a straight one-to-one parody of whatever the thing is that it's making fun of. So we don't have stand-ins for everything in Spawn, or we don't have to, there are several, but we don't have to make up brand new characters and just like make them rhyme or give them or make it basically the exact same character, but just one letter is removed. Everything that's in Radioactive Man is here, but it's retooled to be Spawn, and it uses that to directly talk about things that are happening in the industry. And so you've got so each character in this shows up in other issues, and you've probably seen before if you've read other Radioactive Man things, and it's not exactly Spawn. So it's not like what you would expect this to do is our main character makes a deal with the devil, and he and he's given a costume, and he goes to Earth, and he's lamenting that and walking around in a dark alley, and like, you'd expect it to be like the way a lot of cartoon shows used to handle A Christmas Carol, where everybody is just a stand-in for the characters in A Christmas Carol. But this doesn't do that. It's still a Radioactive Man story, just retooling things a little bit to be more like Spawn. So we're treating... So I guess what I mean is it's more about the overall like atmosphere of it than it is anything, and then it finds clever ways to take the details of its subject and fit them into this unique material in the first place. So the main thing that Radioactive Man has in common here with Spawn is that he has amnesia, and it's played really tragic, and we kind of pretend like it's just as sad that Radioactive Man can't get this lightning bolt off his head and he has to wear hats all the time in order to conceal it, as the fact that Al Simmons has to walk around Earth as a hellspawn and can't see his wife again. So the idea is he wants to propose to his girlfriend Gloria, but he's afraid that she's going to find out that he is Radioactive Man because of this lightning bolt on his head, and that's played as tragic as that, which is really funny. And he's he gets his giant cape, which he can barely deal with, to be more like Spawn, and the idea is his PR people are trying to force him to be grittier and appeal more to the kids, and he hates that. He doesn't want to do that, and so ultimately there is a new stand-in for Radioactive Man that looks a lot like what you would expect a 90s Radioactive Man to look like. And I kind of see that as their overkill stand-in. He's got straps everywhere. His costume is real overdone. He's super beefy. He's overly muscular. And we also have, at the same time, a cyborg who is a regular character in this book as well. And she is Pneumatica. And I don't know if that's always her name, because there's one of the gags in this book is we're constantly renaming characters for each of these stories, but usually they'll have a name and then they'll change it for the sake of this, instead of just this time when we meet them, they have a different name. But she, I guess, also is an overkill-like character in that she's a cyborg. I think that's why she's paired up with him, but eventually, at the end of this, it's weird how involved the story is for as silly and goofy as it is, and it's kind of at large making fun of how soap opera-esque the comic books tend to be. And so it ends up doing, like, kind of every era simultaneously. Like, it's starting in its period in the 90s, and this feels like a thing that you could make now, like looking backwards, making fun of how cheesy everything was in the early 90s, but kids were eating it up with a spoon and treating it like it was the most serious thing in the world. It's so self-aware about what's happening in the medium now, and it may be one of, if not the most self-aware things I've seen in dealing with that stuff, where, like, it realizes already how dated all of this is going to look later, which is one of the things I really like about it. Look how dynamic some of these panels are. I love the again, just how accurate the panel layouts are, but how we're playing around with close-ups on faces. We do a lot of that in Image, where in order to make it feel more dramatic, we get right up on the face a lot. We've got a lot of these blank, like solid color backgrounds. So anyway, I'll just briefly finish the story here. So Radioactive Man goes up against his arch nemesis, Dr. Crabb, who blames him for with the experiment that turned the hero into Radioactive Man, for eventually making him become a giant prawn. And so he makes a thing called the regressor ray, which is a device that will turn him back into a regular person, but also will take them back to an earlier age in comics, which is really funny. We also satirize how slowly time moves in comics and how inconsistent ages are in this, which I like a lot. So there's a line where Radioactive Man, in talking to the scientist that's trying to help him get the rot off his head, says, hey, it's kind of weird that you've been trying to get this off my head for 30 years, but you've only aged, but you're only 12 years old, so how does that work? And he talks at the end about how he has remained like 25 forever, and he says that's why nobody gives me birthday presents. Radioactive Man has all of these really kind of lame jokes that are really funny in the context of this, I think, because of the juxtaposition of those corny jokes that don't really land and a lot of really biting satire about comics. Almost like it's using even those jokes to satirize like one-liners with superheroes and how not funny a lot of things in comics, particularly in just before this, would be played up as funnier than they are. And also, there's a lot of stuff that I'm skipping around, but there's also stuff that I like about just the main trappings of Radioactive Man that I had forgotten about. I like that he fights in a city called Zenith because he is he's an electric powered hero, and Zenith was a huge like a radio and TV company at that time, which or more in the 50s and 60s, and actually they were huge in the 80s too, but then they started folding. Around this time, they've stopped being as popular, and I think they were done by the 2000s, if memory serves. But that's a fun idea. And then all of a sudden, Radioactive Man, once this regressor ray is used on him, is real tall and skinny and becomes Radio Man and has different powers. Now he can manipulate radio waves instead of just being a generic electricity kind of superhero. And so he, just out of nowhere, this is such a Simpsons joke, his arch nemesis is a Nazi, because we have to have the panel where he punches him out like Hitler. And then we find out that an evil worm that I guess has been in other Radioactive Man books was behind the whole thing the whole time. And then we make fun of the 5-minute wrap-up, or I guess I should say in comics, the kind of 1 or 2 page wrap-up, where you have the really easy, poetic death for the villain who just steps on a wire and zaps himself to death and dies, and then all of a sudden it's Spawn again, back in a back alley with those same kind of panel layouts and kind of camera angles, and then out of nowhere, I shouldn't say out of nowhere. Weirdly, this is kind of, I don't want to say tightly plotted, but it's really well organized. Everything that happens in this is set up from something earlier on. So it's not just a bunch of random silly stuff that happens. There's a lot of thought and care put into the storytelling with this issue, and this would translate really well to television. I think this easily could have been its own cartoon show, and the pacing is right for a 2022 episode of episode of a cartoon, and so Pneumatica turns out to be Radioactive Man's mother, and his dad has been out looking for her, thinks that he's never going to see his wife again, and so it ends on this really silly kind of happy ending where the other Radioactive Man, the way we kind of wrap up that subplot, gets sued for copyright infringement, and then everything is hunky-dory at the end, except Dr. Prawn, or I guess Dr. Crabb, but Prawn, because he ends up being turned back into the big monster creature, because I guess it wears off eventually, is doing machinations at the end with Richard Nixon in his head in a jar. And so immediately, I know what a lot of you guys are thinking. This is just Futurama, right? This is 1994. This is 5 years before Futurama happens, and there's a lot of Futurama stuff in this. It's weird. Prawn reminds me a lot of Zoidberg. The doctor guy reminds me of a character in that show. I can't put my finger on who right now. When he's out of costume, I forget his regular name, but Radioactive Man looks a lot like, particularly on this panel, looks a lot like Fry in the face. And then we just have Nixon's head in a jar, like we get all over the place in Futurama. And I think Nixon is maybe kind of a recurring gag in Radioactive Man, because he shows up for obvious reasons in the Watchmen parody as well, with 679 or whatever the number was of that issue. But anyway, there's a surprising amount. I know I was jumping all over the place with this review. There is and by the way, I'm shooting this in the morning, which I don't usually do. So I just got up half an hour ago, and I'm trying to unpack this whole thing. There's a surprising amount to sink your teeth into here. With the comedy and with all the details about the comic industry and the specific artist with McFarlane, especially, that we're making fun of here. And there's, I didn't even talk about political commentary, or I should say political satire. One of the jokes that I think I'd be remiss in not bringing up is there's a whole thing about the superhero team in this universe disbanding because they don't like being controlled by the government, and going off to make their own company or their own superhero team. And they say that it's superhero owned, which in this context is obviously talking about what happened with Image and all the creators there that left Marvel and DC and went to do their own thing and have their own freedom and have control of their characters. And I'm not sure if the guy at the end that shows up to subpoena the fake Radioactive Man is supposed to be Cerebus, but he looks like Cerebus, unless that's just a character that already existed in this. But yeah, there's a lot packed in here, and there's a lot of bang for your buck. So yeah, I really recommend these. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you again tomorrow with another one. No idea what I'm going to do yet, but the one thing I can guarantee you is it will be a single comic book that I own. Thanks a lot for watching. Leave a comment and let me know if you've ever read these, and if you've read any of the Bongo Simpson stuff in general. I haven't read a ton, but I really like what I have looked at. And Austin and I, a couple years ago, reviewed my favorite thing that I've read anyway from this stuff, which was The Simpsons Futurama, big double hardcover crossover, and I massively recommend that as well, for a lot of the same reasons with this, where it's not just general comedy, but it's talking specifically about the history of comics and goofy tropes and things that happen both in stories and also with the industry itself. And something else that I should mention about this is, and one of the things I really appreciate, is that this issue in particular, but Radioactive Man in general, does a good job of just being a fun, silly story that you can read even if you don't understand all of that, but there's a whole other layer if you are familiar with comics. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you again next time. I was Captain Logan, and happy reading.